shadows in the dark. Don't trust what you cannot see. Touch your skin and I call your name. It's just the past that looks back at me. Left your home just to get away, but you took the buses with you. Set things up just to break them down. Keeps your mind down, nothing new. There's no inspiration, media actually does. Gone up and savior, government hunts them down. There's no inspiration, media actually does. Gone up and savior, government hunts them down. Yeah, all that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been for, been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else, taken. Yeah. Watch out the TV, how I'm dope. My knives are Lucy reruns. Talk shows open, current hit. Sanctioned self-indulgent numb. Throw away what you got. Blame what's missing from your life. It's not your fault things worked out this way. It's someone's mother, daughter, wife. There's no inspiration, media actually does. Gone off saviors, government hunts them down. There's no inspiration, media actually does. Gone off saviors, government hunts them down. Yeah, all that's left for you to see is a reflection of myself. All that I've been taken by someone else. Taken by someone else, taken. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Oh, wrong button. Hey, everybody. I am Jayme CheeseSlice. I'm the producer engineer of Left on Left. And today we have Max Parry on to talk about some covert action that's going on where we're supporting people that maybe we shouldn't be supporting. But without further ado, let me go ahead and bring on Gloria and Jayme. Hello, Gloria. Hello,
Hey,
Jayme.
Hi.
You
Hey,
guys
Jayme.
ready? You guys ready to do this? Here's Max, and we are going to record an hour-long show for WBAI and the Progressive Radio Network. So, Gloria, I'm going to hand over the show to you, and you take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I'm Gloria Guillo, a former administrator in New York City government, an investigative journalist, vice chair at WBAI Radio, and a co-founder of Green Renaissance Sovereign Rights Movement, a group so left it's right on. I'm joined here today by our resident expert, Jayme Kuzmarov. Jayme is a professor at Tulsa Community College, a historian, investigative journalist, and managing editor of Covert Action magazine, an online magazine that focuses on CIA and deep state activity. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and our guest, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. Our content is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Listeners should form their own opinions based on their own research. Today's show is on the CIA's sponsored separatist terrorism in Chechnya. We are pleased to welcome our guest, Max Parry. He is an investigative journalist and geopolitical analyst. We will be discussing part one in his two-part series on Chechnya. Part one recently appeared in Covert Action magazine on April 24th. It's titled, "Did the CIA Covertly Support Chechen Separatist Terrorism?" Of course they did. Yes, dear listeners, of course the CIA supported Chechen separatists. How could they not? Destabilizing countries by making them ungovernable so they can be raided by corporate America and its elite foreign partners is what our intelligence agencies do. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's the job description for the predator class's go-to henchmen. Chechnya was ideal, not just because of its oil and strategic geography, but also because of the brutality of the conflict, which could be weaponized against Russia's image internationally, and Russia could be mired down with military costs. Sound familiar? It's the same playbook used in Afghanistan, where the US armed the Mujahideen against the Soviets, knowing full well it would create chaos for generations, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Keep in mind that economic and political disruption represents a grave loss to the working and impoverished class in all countries, not just the targeted country. There is always negative blowback to us here at home. We remain trapped between rising costs, falling wages, and increased scarcity. Within this context, chaos is always represented a win for the predator class in all countries. Excess capital and resource hoarding keeps them insulated from sharp currency devaluations, skyrocketing inflation, and the loss of affordable key inputs. And the predator class not only benefits from shorting failing economies with insider trading secrets, but also from buying up land, resources, and human capital for pennies on the dollar. When economic freefall hits bottom, folks, this is called vulture capitalism for a reason. So let's be clear. The line between freedom fighter and terrorist has always been elastic, depending on whether or not a given country serves U.S. corporate interests or that of their own nation and its respective people. Either a leader is a U.S. puppet and a traitor to their country, or branded unjustly as an undemocratic, authoritarian strongman. But U.S. puppets don't last long if we consider the trajectory of Manuel Noriega or Saddam Hussein. When Chechen militants attacked Russian civilians, they were framed in the Western press as rebels fighting for independence. Only later, when some of these same networks were revealed to be aligned with global jihadist movements, did the prevailing narrative start to unravel. But by then, the damage was done. Timing and positioning are everything in propaganda and mind wars. Everyone remembers headlines and front page lies. No one remembers page 3 truths in small print when the dust settles. The CIA didn't have to officially run terrorist training camps themselves. All they needed to do was create the political cover necessary to keep the pipeline of money and weapons flowing to them. Well, maybe they did train leaders in assassination techniques and provide some torture handbooks too. Plausible deniability is considered the CIA's trademark, and it is maintained through its extensive network of cutouts and proxies, all with our tax dollars. Yes, first we pay the CIA to promote terrorism, and then we pay the CIA to route the profits extracted by killings, rapes, and torture to BlackRock. We might think that what we don't know won't hurt us, but it always will. The economic noose is tightening while we absent-mindedly watch Netflix and drink a beer. Please take it away, Max, before I ask you to pass the metaphorical chips. Thank you.
Hi, Gloria. Thank you for having me. And I had no idea you were a musician, so I really enjoyed that introduction there with the music as well.
Thanks.
But I think your introduction there is very accurate. And I just wanted to say that right out the bat, before people read my article, that I think it's very important to understand that I think there's a common misperception these days that most people are hip to the fact that I think in recent years that the CIA has supported Islamist terrorists in Syria, for example. There was the recent contentious confirmation hearing with Tulsi Gabbard, where she brought up Timber Sycamore and the CIA support for Syrian Islamists. And then, of course, before that, Libya. But I think there's a common misperception that somehow between those two conflicts and the 1980s, when the CIA supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that in the intervening period, there was maybe a breakdown in relations as far as the CIA using Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups as a strategic asset. But really, if you look at the history, even in the period where the U.S. was ostensibly pursuing bin Laden, in the 1990s and after 9/11, of course, there really was not a breakdown in relations as far as them being used as a strategic asset, because in multiple theaters of conflict, both in the Balkans and what I talk about in my article in the Caucasus, Chechnya, they were still very much supporting them. And, this happened just as, outwardly, the official story was that, after the Gulf War and the conflict between Kuwait and Iraq, that the official story is that bin Laden had offered to do a similar kind of operation as in Afghanistan with the Saudis, offering his foreign fighters to be used there, and that the Saudis had spurned him, and then he was kicked out of Saudi Arabia, and he declared this so-called holy war on the U.S. and was supposedly upset about the U.S. presence of troops in Saudi Arabia. And then he was, at least on the surface, publicly being pursued for the bombings of embassies in Africa, and then the USS Cole, and so on and so forth. But during that whole time, the U.S. and the CIA were supporting elements of his network, both in Bosnia, where two of the alleged 9/11 hijackers fought, and as well as in Kosovo. They delisted the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was prior to that on the State Department's list of terrorist organizations, and had all kinds of connections to Al-Qaeda and organized crime. And they supported them against Serbia in the Kosovo War. And then on top of that, the U.S. was also supporting, as I talk about in my article, parts of bin Laden's network in Chechnya, in the Caucasus, against Russia. And so there was never any kind of real severing of ties. And, it was always funny to me, the fact that, before 9/11, there were these interviews with bin Laden with like CNN and even, I believe, ABC's Nightline, where the reporters go there with all they had to do was put a blindfold over them and drive them in a car to bin Laden's undisclosed location. So
I like the fact where bin Laden gets younger as the videos are played. Thanks.
Yeah. And he's, it's just hilarious to me that these mainstream news outlets could find him, but the CIA for some reason could not locate him. But no, there was never any interruption. The U.S. was using them as a strategic asset, and this especially beefed up in the Second Chechen War, as the Chechen Separatist movement became increasingly Wahhabized, thanks to the influence of U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and the importation of foreign fighters, namely this guy, Ibn al-Khattab, who was part of bin Laden's network. He was a close confidant of both bin Laden and the leader of the Chechen Separatists' most radical faction, this guy named Shamil Basayev. And so there was and the U.S. government knew full well that the Chechen Separatist government in exile, the Ichkerian government, was allowing Khattab to operate on their territory. I mean, doing research for this article, I watched a press conference with the U.S. representative of the Ichkerian government, which everybody can watch on C-SPAN. His name is Leoma Usmanov. And in this press conference, which is prior to 9/11 in 1999, one of the journalists even asked him, Russia's saying that, your independence movement has connections to Al-Qaeda. Do you have any of these people on your territory? And his answer, he goes, oh, no, we only have one Al-Qaeda member in our territory, Khattab. And then they ask him, well, why is he in your country? Why don't you arrest him and hand him over to Russian authorities if you're not, in bed with Islamists? And he goes on to admit that, oh, well, certain parts of our government he's here by invitation. So they even admit that it was the kind of thing where the so-called moderates in the movement, the nationalists, were using the Islamists as a fighting force. And then in turn, the Islamists were using the so-called moderates, the nationalists, for political cover and legitimacy, which is what, Zbigniew Brzezinski and all the various Atlanticist foreign policy mandarins, that's what they were outwardly supporting. But there was never really any, apart from a few elements, which are the people who are in charge of Chechnya now, there was a very thin line always between the so-called moderates or nationalists and the Islamists. And they were always using one another for political opportunism. But my main point is that I think that a lot of people have become hip in recent years to how the CIA has supported terrorists in Syria to oust Assad, and they're now in power there. But and of course to depose Gaddafi in Libya under Obama. But there was never really a breakdown. I mean, they might have ostensibly been pursuing Al Qaeda and their affiliated elements in other places, in individual places, but overall they were still being used as a strategic asset, as part of this U.S. effort to undermine Russia. And they're also doing the same thing as well in Xinjiang, in with the Uyghur secessionists, the East Turkestan Islamic Party, and various Al Qaeda elements there as well. This has been a long-standing strategy of the United States, and there's never been any sort of breakdown in relations at all. It's been an uninterrupted thing, really, since going back to 1979 when the Carter administration and Brzezinski launched Operation Cyclone.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think it goes before that. There's an excellent book you probably read by Robert Dreyfus called Devil's Game, How the West Helped to Arm Fundamentalist Islam. And he traces the origin of what you're describing to the 1950s and this conference at Princeton University with some of the foreign policy elite and academics and with elements of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, who they were arming to undermine Nasser in Egypt. And yeah, I mean, he explained that there's a logic to the strategy, is that the goal of U.S. foreign policy is very simple: world domination and control in the Middle East. That entailed control over the oil, and Nasser and his brand of government were the greatest threat, because Nasser was a socialist who was pushing nationalization measures, as well as over things like the Suez Canal, and was trying to build a pan-Arab coalition, a unity of the Arab states to take back control over their natural resources and stand up to Western imperialism. So he and his breed of leader was the threat. Gaddafi was cut in his mold. So they made a calculation that the Islamic forces were a preferable alternative to Pan-Arabic socialism. And that decision, I think, was made in the 1950s. And you see, and Dreyfus has many different chapters, going back from that time. He has stuff on the U.S. support for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and even Hamas. They created Hamas. Yes. The Israelis and CIA may have been involved as an antidote to the secular Palestinian Liberation Organization. And Dreyfus has a chapter and hard information on that. And he has. So, yeah, I think your analysis is right on the mark. And it shows that, and this has long roots, and it showed the farce of the war on terror, that this was really just for public relations. And the war on terror has entailed a massive expansion of the U.S. military presence in the Middle East, in line with the goals of the neoconservatives. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, and then I have a couple other questions. can ask.
Before you do, I just want to underscore something that you're both saying, just to make it more clear to our audience. What you're both saying is that, I believe, is that this is not about religion. And this is really not about an economic system. This is about what is the best way to support corporate plunder. And through destabilization and through a puppet regime, it's really a seamless way to extract all kinds of things. So just please comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I actually have not read that book, but I have read other accounts of how the Muslim Brotherhood came to fruition. And that's absolutely accurate. And I will definitely consult that book because, I mean, the one part that you didn't mention was how in the 1980s, I know they also supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria as well, which is sort of the
Yes.
root of that conflict, because there was a very bloody insurgency and also a very bloody crackdown by Hafez Assad, Bashar's father. And yeah, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood was something that is very similar. They were sort of more practical in their approach than Al Qaeda, in the sense that they, in certain places, have like run political candidates and done activism in addition to terrorism. But their end goal of creating an Islamic State and, you know, takfir and preaching an intolerant and bloodthirsty form of Islam is the same. And yes, they did very successfully divided the secular Arab nationalists in many cases against one another, even, you know, dividing Iraq and Syria, for example, pitting them against one another. And, you know, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, that's really sort of the roots of what later went on in that conflict as well. So yeah, it's a long-standing strategy by the U.S. and its allies going back many decades. I think that the creation of Al Qaeda, you know, that sort of stems directly from the U.S. support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But many of those fighters, like for example, Khattab, I mentioned, who was bin Laden's official representative in the Caucasus in Chechnya, he had fought in Afghanistan in the 1980s. He had also fought in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that's where he met Shamil Basayev. So this is an international network that the U.S. is supporting, and it all comes full circle, yeah, going back to things like the Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in the 80s. Many of those foreign fighters went on to fight in Chechnya, in Bosnia, in the Balkans as well. And, you know, it's a long-standing, decades-long strategy where they have supported this nexus. And yeah, like you were saying about, unfortunately, the secular Arab nationalists and even the Marxists like the PFLP in the Palestinian Liberation Movement, they were siloed and isolated, and their place was taken by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and all that. It's been a very long-standing strategy to defeat the most progressive elements in that part of the world and replace them with these Islamist groups. That's not to discount the Palestinian Liberation Movement, and in fact, that's something that's actually used to like discredit the Palestinians and their legitimate grievances, is, you know, to point to the fact that they're led by Islamists in Gaza. But that's a creation of these very same people, you know, arguably. So yeah, they have used them as a strategic asset in many, many different theaters of conflict. And, you know, in the case of Chechnya, it's something that arose after, you know, the fall of the Soviet Union, you know, where you had the Soviet Union was breaking apart, and all these different post-Soviet territories were declaring their independence. And, you know, the ultimate goal that's been expressed by people, not only people like Brzezinski, but also Dick Cheney, is to ultimately balkanize Russia and acquire its resources. Because yes, Chechnya southern Russia is a very energy-rich, oil-rich region. I mean, the Caucasus are as a whole, but it's right, directly next to the Caspian Sea. And, they used Russia. I mean, they used Islamists in Afghanistan to lure the Soviet Union into giving it its own Vietnam by Brzezinski's admission. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, they turned to the Muslim population internally within Russia, because Russia has something like close to 25 million Muslims there. And they began trying to weaponize, the most radical elements there. And, traditionally, Chechens are actually practitioners of Sufism, which is basically like a mystical form of Islam. But as they did throughout the world, Saudi Arabia, the U.S.'s ally, they deliberately spread Wahhabism, which is a very fundamentalist and intolerant strain of Islam, a perversion of it that goes back, to the British colonialism in the region in the Middle East, and was something that came about that way. It was something that was largely rejected by Islam, but it's been deliberately spread by Saudi Arabia with the help of the West. And they imported that ideology into southern Russia and tried to use it as a wedge, or a way of trying to break apart with the secessionist movement. This part of Russia that is Muslim majority, because they want access to their resources. And Boris Yeltsin, had tried to. The first Chechen war was actually much more brutal in terms of the Russian assault, in terms of indiscriminate bombing. But Putin actually solved that conflict because he came, not only because he waged the war much more competently, probably because he wasn't inebriated the whole time like Mr. Yeltsin, but also he was able to reach a compromise with the actual moderate elements there in the Kadyrovs, not these so-called moderates in the Ichkerian government that the U.S. was giving support to and safe harbor to. And that's why now Chechnya is actually a very stable area. It's Grozny is known as like the Dubai of the Caucasus, because it's actually very opulent there now. And of course, now that's when the U.S. decides to come out with all these allegations that there's all these human rights violations there. Now that terrorism is actually not as big of a problem as it once was. So yeah, long story short, this is a long-standing strategy where they have tried to use, the most intolerant strains of Islam for their own geopolitical goals. And Chechnya is just one of those many places where the CIA has done this.
And yeah, well, maybe if you can give us some more detail, from your article, you mentioned these kind of front organizations, American Committee for Peace in Chechnya. They always use the name Peace.
Yeah.
And also what role the NED may have played in funneling money, National Endowment for Democracy, to covertly funnel resources to Islamic jihadists or anti-Russia groups in Chechnya. And also the role that Brzezinski and some of the neoconservatives have played.
Well, the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya played a very instrumental role. It was a think tank that was founded actually, I believe not coincidentally, right exactly as Putin was taking power. And its roster, if you look at its lists of members, it's like a who's who list of neoconservatives, all the most ultra hawkish neocons, even though Brzezinski himself was considered a realist as far as foreign policy doctrine goes. But, all these people on this list were the most arch neoconservative figures: Richard Pearl, Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, who's Victoria Nuland's wife, or husband, excuse me. All these arch neocons. And it's well known that they were one of the NGOs that was providing support to the Chechens. And of course, they tried to claim that they were only supporting the so-called nationalists or the moderates. But we now know that's not the case. And in fact, they also used, under the banner of charitable organizations or philanthropic aid organizations, they use that as a cover to provide support to the Chechens. And in fact, we know this for a fact because it was actually the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, which was carried out supposedly by two Chechen American brothers in Boston. And in the wake of that bombing, the uncle of the Tsarnaev brothers was interviewed on television, and a lot of journalists started looking into his background. And it turned out that the uncle of the Tsarnaev brothers, this guy Ruslan Tsarny, during the 1990s, not only was married to the daughter of Graham Fuller, who was a lifelong CIA operative. He was the CIA station chief in Afghanistan on the eve of Operation Cyclone back in 1978. He was married to Graham Fuller's daughter and lived in Graham Fuller's home. And he incorporated an organization called the Congress for Chechen International Organizations. And that organization shared an address, used Fuller's home as an address. And there was an earlier front company that was shut down by the U.S. Treasury Department called Benevolence International. It was shut down by the U.S. Treasury Department for being a known front of Al Qaeda and bin Laden, where all these Saudi businessmen were providing support to bin Laden. And in that case, Ruslan Tsarny's group had provided support to the Chechen Separatists, mine-resistant blast boots, for all we know, arms, but lots of other various X-ray machines, various military equipment. And they had done transactions with Benevolence International while Ruslan Tsarny was living in Graham Fuller's home. So this is a direct line that can be traced from a lifelong CIA officer's home, who just so happens to be the CIA station chief in Kabul back in 1978, where this support is going to the Chechen Separatists. I mean, this is as close to a smoking gun as it gets. And it's indisputable because Benevolence International was shut down long before any of these revelations came about, or the Boston Marathon bombing occurred. So all of this came out long after the fact. But we now know in retrospect that this is what's going on, and it was just one of many fake charities that was providing support to the Chechens under the guise or cover of so-called humanitarian aid. And that's I have a part 2 to this article that's coming out, which really gets into more detail into that aspect, specifically the humanitarian aid aspect. But the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya was just one of many organizations that were, on that basis, under the nonprofit industrial complex basis, providing support to the Chechen Separatists. And of course, they claimed, yes, it was to the moderates or the nationalists. But all that support was, for example, the leader of the moderate, the Ichkerian government, Aslan Mazgadov. You can look him up and find pictures of him with Shamil Basayev in the battlefield. They led the battles in Grozny together and other incursions into even neighboring republics like Ingushetia and Dagestan. The line between the so-called moderates and the Islamists who were directly connected to Al-Qaeda was very, very, there was no line, really. Maybe some of the rhetoric they espoused as far about what kind of state they wanted to create was different, but it was very superficial. And, these people were getting support from the United States and the CIA, and Yeah, I mean, the Boston Marathon bombing, that's just one specific example out of many where these sort of revelations came out. And actually, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother, the one who was killed, it had come out in Russian newspapers in the wake of that bombing that he had, prior to the Boston Marathon bombing, had traveled abroad in the Caucasus and even attended seminars that were put on by an NGO that was affiliated with the Jamestown Foundation, which is another think tank that Brzezinski was part of, and that was another source of support for the Chechens, and that had all kinds of other, neocon ghouls on its advisory board. So they had a whole a network or constellation of different nonprofits and think tanks that were supporting the Chechen Separatists, and it's come out in multiple ways. But I think the revelations that came out with the Boston Marathon bombing were the closest thing to a smoking gun. And I just want to add, I think it's very disturbing because while I was doing research for this article, I don't know why. I mean, I really respect this organization, but the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, I understand that Mr. Fuller is actually now a member, and he seems to be going through some kind of rehabilitation campaign, so to speak. And I know that organization has a variety of different people in it from the intelligence community. But this is a guy that still has outstanding warrants, I understand, in Turkey for being for his affiliation with Fethullah Gulen, who is wanted in Turkey for supposedly backing a coup to overthrow Erdogan. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But the Gulen movement is another area where Islamist radicals were reportedly recruited to fight in Chechnya. There's a very courageous whistleblower who actually retweeted my article. She gave it her endorsement. Her name is Sibel Edmonds, and she was a 9/11 whistleblower at the FBI. She was a translator, but she was gagged under the state secrets privilege by John Ashcroft and the Bush administration. And one of the reasons she claims that she was gagged in that court order was because she had done translation work and was privy to classified knowledge of CIA operations in the Caucasus, basically, where they were supporting people like this. And she's done a lot of great work about the Gulen movement and its ties to Islamist groups, and including the Al-Qaeda elements in Chechnya as well. And, there's a lot of links. You were talking about the Muslim Brotherhood earlier. The Gulen movement is very, very closely tied to the Muslim Brotherhood as well. So, I mean, this is I mean, I could have written an entire book about this subject, really. It got so long that I had to divide the article into two parts. But honestly, the subject matter was so depressing, specifically some of the terrorist attacks that these people waged, specifically the Beslan school massacre, which, reading about that for a few weeks, I had to take a break because it was so upsetting. I mean, this is a case where these terrorists, they took almost 800 or over 1,100 people, but almost 800 children. They put them in a school gymnasium that was rigged with tripwire explosives, bombs hanging off a basketball hoop. And, the Russian government was criticized for their response, for going in, guns blazing, trying to get them out. And the reason, people can make that criticism if they want, but as I talk about in the article, the Separatists had taken almost 3,000 people in a hospital hostage earlier in the 90s under Yeltsin. And the Russians had caved into their demands. They gave them everything. They withdrew from the Caucasus, and there was a ceasefire temporarily. And what did these Islamists do? They invaded Dagestan and tried to expand their territory. And the Republic of Ichkeria, which was short-lived, it became a haven not only for Islamist terrorism but organized crime, tribal killings. It was just an absolute. It's ironic you have all these Western human rights groups talking about how Chechnya is this terrible place where all these human rights violations. In the 90s, it was literally a lawless region of banditry and terrorism. So yeah, it's I could have written a whole book about this, but the subject was so upsetting. The barbarism of these terrorist groups. The Chechen Separatists really rival ISIS as far as their cruelty and willingness to take a school full of children, and and the fact that there was criticism for the Russian government's response, but where was the criticism for the United States and its allies basically supporting these people all around the world? It's one thing if you want to criticize Russia for their response, but I don't know how you negotiate with people like that or what you're supposed to do in that situation. It was a lose-lose situation. And arguably more people would have died because they were threatening to kill them all if they didn't give them what they want. So, and you can see why. I don't understand how, like, for example, knowing what these people are capable of, like in the Syrian conflict where the United States was pointing the finger at Assad when chemical weapons were used. It's like, you don't think that these people are the more likely culprit? Look at their track record. Look at the stuff that they do. And, the same thing, it was the same sort of hypocrisy and, just because the United States has an agenda against Russia, especially under Putin, because he has not played ball with the United States. He pushed back against the NATO expansion, and he brought an end to that conflict that they wanted to continue indefinitely in Chechnya. I watched the Oliver Stone interviews, and there's a great section in that series, the Putin interviews with Oliver Stone, where they talk about the CIA support for the Chechens, and Putin says that he confronted Bush about the matter, and that Bush, feigned surprise about it, but then they later got a communique from the CIA saying, no, we can continue. We have the right to continue supporting these people, and there's nothing you can do about it. The U.S. is, the support for these people was really done pretty brazenly. They claim that it was the moderates, but the ties between these so-called moderates and the extremists, it's not like this is secret information. One of the people is this guy, Ahmed Zakayev, who lives in England to this day, actually. There's pictures of him readily available online at Shamil Basayev's birthday party, who was the guy who openly admitted and confessed to, yes, I planned both the Beslan school massacre and also the hostage taking that happened at a musical theater in Moscow, the Dubrovka Theater, where they took almost 900 people hostage in that incident. And I remember even at the time, I'm about 39 years old, so at the time I was a teenager, but I remember even seeing like the CNN coverage at the time of the Dubrovka Theater standoff, and they were referring to them as rebels. And this was not long. This was just a few months after 9/11 when that attack occurred. And I remember even as a teenager thinking, that's odd. Like, why are they calling them rebels? Aren't they taking, like, says they have 1,000 people in this theater hostage, and it says that they're Islamic terrorists. But there was never any connection made between the groups in Chechnya and the groups that the U.S. was supposedly pursuing after 9/11. And in fact, that's another area where, the 9/11 investigation, it's arguable that attack, could have been prevented had the U.S. Followed up on tips they received, the FBI, because the so-called 20th hijacker, Zacarias Moussaoui, he was arrested a few weeks prior to 9/11. And while he was in custody, he was a French citizen of Moroccan descent. And the FBI officer or agent who arrested him, did a background check with the French authorities. And they said, oh, this guy is a terrorist. He's been recruiting people for this guy, Khattab in Chechnya. He's part of bin Laden's network. And the FBI field agent tried to get a FISA warrant to look in Moussaoui's computer. And they wouldn't issue it to him because they didn't consider the Chechen Separatists, even though they were part of bin Laden's network, to be sufficiently associated with a terrorist organization. That's the way the 9/11 Commission report. Had they looked in that computer, this is assuming that they didn't know about it all to begin with, but had they looked in that computer, they would have probably found out there were all these sleeper cells that were like Moussaoui, taking flying lessons without learning how to land, doing these dry runs, so on and so forth. But they wouldn't issue a warrant. And, Colleen Rowley, who I know Jayme knows, and you probably know too, Gloria, I've seen her write about this and talk about this incident as well. And that's just one of many cases where they could have, prevented the 9/11 attacks. But they did not consider the Chechens to be part of the bin Laden's international network. They're supporting him over here and supposedly pursuing him here. It's just outrageous. And of course, the mainstream media doesn't put a spotlight on this. It's on page 10, buried in in the middle of the paper.
Well, what about the alternative? Because our show, we're critical on this show of the alternative media, and a lot of what you're discussing here, very few people understand, and we don't find much coverage at all in alternative media. So, can you comment on that? I mean, and we've been discussing on the show the need, these protests on the campus, that they need to broaden their message that, yes, this is horrible what's going on in Gaza, but it's part of a larger pattern of U.S. foreign policy of arming, as you've been describing, terrorist groups, and part of a drive. That the root of the evil is the drive for world domination and the greed and these corporate interests that are pushing for control over oil, and how they elevate the neoconservatives. But I mean, is any of this covered in alternative media? And where did you get your information from in researching this?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, yeah. I think alternative media, especially if you're referring to things like Democracy Now! Or, things like that, have really dropped the ball. I mean, it was really disappointing. I remember, I used to listen to the Democracy Now! Back during the days of the Iraq War. And I remember I really started to lose respect for them, like when the Libyan conflict started, and the way that, they were not really talking about the real political character of these so-called rebel groups that were waging this so-called, Arab Spring or revolution against Gaddafi. Even as when they captured him, they sodomized him with a bayonet. And, you had people like Dennis Kucinich coming back from having visited there saying, I saw an Al-Qaeda flag hanging from, the embassy building in Tripoli. And yeah, I mean, the same thing happened, of course, with the Syria conflict, where, where people are having to turn to more and more outlets that are, especially in this day and age, really being shadow banned and censored by the algorithms of big tech. And as far as where I had to do my research, I mean, I read several books on the case. I consulted a lot of actual documents. I did meticulous research as far as making sure I sourced everything correctly in the article. But yeah, even in many cases, a lot of alternative media really did not cover Libya and Syria accurately. And just as the same thing was the case with not just Chechnya, but the Balkans. I mean, there was large swaths of the left, whitewashing, demonizing the Serbs in that conflict, just like mainstream media. And yeah, right now, I mean, with the Gaza thing, I mean, yes, many people are very aware of that conflict, but then a lot of the same people you will see, cheerleading the fall of Assad in Syria, and these people who have now taken power, and the new Syrian regime there, I saw has made it clear that they want to join the Abraham Accords and be part of normalized ties with Israel, which is why it's total bullshit. I don't know if I can curse on here. I'm sorry. That supposedly one of the reasons that bin Laden cited in the 90s when he was supposedly being pursued by the U.S. was he claimed that he was upset over the Israeli occupation of Palestine, in addition to the troops being present in Saudi Arabia. But Al-Qaeda, it's almost become a joke at this point that they never do anything to attack Israel. And this, this al-Shara or Jelani or whatever his name is this week, expressing his intention that this new Syrian regime, is willing to normalize ties with Israel. I think that says it all about the, so-called, the Islamist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, just like the Gulf states, they're crypto-Zionists, ultimately, at the end of the day. They never do anything. I mean, one of the main reasons I believe that Assad was knocked off the chessboard was because of the Syrian government, no matter what you think about it, had always supported the Palestinians. And ultimately, that's the reason that, Saddam Hussein even was knocked off the chessboard, and Gaddafi, and so on and so forth. And the U.S. is always supporting the most backwards medieval regimes in the region, while calling the most relatively progressive, whatever faults they may have and all, the more progressive governments there, calling them dictatorships. It's, you can really see the same thing with the Chechen conflict, because, Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya now, has really brought stability to that region where he's there was a period of lawlessness where there was tribal retribution killings, and he's set up these councils where this is a society that is very, very, the Soviets had a huge problem with them, and never granted them statehood because it was always very culturally backwards there. At one time, the marriage practice was bride kidnapping. It's a very, the area there is, the idea that they should have their own state. They are allowed now under Kadyrov to have elements of Sharia law, but they're still ultimately beholden to the Russian Constitution, which is the thing that prevents, these grudge killings and tribal warfare and all that. So under Kadyrov, it's become a relatively stable region. Yes, I'm sure there are human rights violations there now. There was this big accusation a few years ago that they were supposedly putting gay men in concentration camps. And of course, there was no evidence to support it. But on top of that, what do they think life would be like for gays in Chechnya had these people that took schools full of hostages, theaters full of hostages, had they taken power? There would be no gay people there, I can tell you that. The Kadyrov is, is the actual moderates, because he and his father, Ahmed Kadyrov, they had been part of the Chechen independence movement, and they defected back to the Russian side, because they saw how it was no longer, I mean, if it ever was, is debatable, but it was certainly no longer a movement for nationalist independence. It was about creating an Islamic State and about creating a bulwark for Western imperialism, like we just seen established here in Syria. It's the same thing. And Putin, to his credit, no matter what one thinks about him in general, like that's one, I mean, there isn't, those wars were absolutely brutal. And he brought that conflict shortly after coming into office to an end. And that's one of many reasons that the U.S. really does not like him, is because they wanted that conflict to continue indefinitely. And their ultimate goal, it's straight from the mouth of people like Brzezinski and Dick Cheney. They want to carve up Russia and have access to its resources and have a pliant puppet in charge, like they did when Boris Yeltsin was president in the 1990s. Regardless of what anyone wants to say about, Putin's social conservatism or his domestic policy, which is ultimately something that is, that's up to the Russian people to decide, not us. And as a statesman, Putin has done things like that, where he has not, starting in 2007 with that big speech he gave at the Munich Security Conference, putting the U.S. on notice that he not only didn't agree with the NATO expansion, but he disagreed with the Iraq War. And I talk about in my article, the Iraq War, there was a little known connection there because with the Chechen separatism aspect, because Owen Powell, at his speech to the UN, he cited something that was true, that there was Islamist elements in the Pankisi Gorge, which is an area with ethnic Chechens in Georgia. But then he added this lie that Al-Qaeda was there and had ties to Saddam Hussein, and he was manufacturing chemical agents. So, that's just one of many elements where you can connect the U.S. foreign policy and its many, many lies to its support for Islamist terrorist groups throughout the world. And Chechnya, I think, is one of the lesser known conflicts, and that's why I wrote this article about it, so people can connect the dots.
Hey, Max, please tell our audience how they can follow your important work and financially support your efforts. Also, let me give a shout out to our audience that I will be on Max's show, Captive Minds, on May 4th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time to discuss my article on how the fossil fuel industry came to love climate change. It was published by Covert Action magazine on October 6, 2023. Max, how can they find you?
Yeah. Looking forward to that. Thank you for returning the favor. We're looking forward to having you on and talking about that. My work currently is, as we mentioned, currently syndicated in CAM, and hopefully continues to be. But yeah, I also just started a podcast called Captive Minds with my colleague, who's a really enthusiastic, very young, but really like a prodigy. Her name's Shayna Batterson. We just started this podcast called Captive Minds. We've done about 6 episodes so far. We've covered everything from the real history of George Soros to
one of my favorites.
Yeah. Well, he features pretty heavily in my second part on the Chechnya conflict, so stay tuned. But we've also covered the CIA and the New Left. We talk about everything. We just did a series on the CIA's use of popular music for soft power, like in the Cold War and today. We cover a lot of the same sorts of things that Covert Action magazine and this show Left on Left covers. So I think that your audience, listeners and viewers, should enjoy it. And yeah, it's me and my co-host Shayna Batterson, who's really great. So people can continue to read my articles in CAM or tune in on Captive Minds.
Have you started a Substack?
I just created a Substack. I haven't published my work on there, but I may definitely start doing that, cross-posting things and whatnot. And yeah, I'm on X and Facebook and various social media places. But yeah, stay tuned for part 2 for my article on Chechnya, which gets into the humanitarian aid aspect. In light of, I think it's really timely in light of the whole USAID scandal with the Trump administration currently. So yeah, that's where people can check out my work. Thank you for having me on, guys.
Well, thanks, Max. And that wraps up our show for today. This is Left on Left. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like, donate, and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week. Okay, we're still recording.
Yep, we're still live.
But we're going to actually sign off and put in the new StreamYard, Jayme. He just
Okay.
I sent an email to you guys.
Yeah.
So
all right, I'll take a 2-minute break and then I'll be back.
Yeah.
on.
So we're all good. But there's going to be a new.
And yeah, we can discuss some future article ideas. Like maybe you can do one for covert action on the CIA and the New Left. That would be great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Jayme, before you leave, the new link is in an email that was sent to us.
All right. I'll be on in 2 minutes.
All right. Me too. Right. Bye.
All right, everybody watching at home. Thanks for watching this. We're going to wrap this up. We're going to jump into recording a whole nother episode for a couple of weeks when we're not going to actually be here live. So thank you for watching this. If you're able to catch us on the radio, please listen and maybe send feedback to the radio station that you enjoy the show. So thanks for watching, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.